Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, or even good night, depending on where you are today. We're happy to have our next installment in the Vietnam Online Seminar, studying firms and labor markets in Vietnam. Our presenter today is going to be Ming Chan from Queen Mary University of London. He's doing his PhD, and this is his looks like it's his first chapter in his dissertation. So I'm sure he'd be happy to get as many comments and feedback as possible. The format that we'll follow today is that we'll basically sort of do the full hour for presentation. We won't sort of save questions to the end, so feel free to ask Ming any questions that you have, both small clarifying questions as well as larger substantive questions throughout the presentation. So, all right, the virtual floor is yours, Ming.
Hi. Well, first of all, thank you for organizing this amazing series. And thank you everyone for being here today. So this is the first chapter of my PhD dissertation. So it's co-author with my supervisors. So any questions or discussion would be really helpful. So thank you for everyone for being here today. I'm happy to take question or discussion throughout the presentation. So right, so let's start with the paper. So this paper is on first um the the first phase of the trade war, which started in 2018. I think everyone here is familiar with the trade war already. The literature on this topic can be divided into the bilateral effect, which focus on the two targeted economies, as as well as the multilateral effect, which is on the other third countries. Um, the third countries effect, the multilateral effect, is mostly focused on how the trade flow reorganized after when the trade war started, uh, which points out that they are China plus one and redirecting of goods, um, and with limited papers on the within countries, on the changes within the countries. Most of the paper that focus on within the countries would look into the Southeast Asian countries or the South American countries, and which is our focus today. And we picked Vietnam to be the case study. If you look in, if you look at the panel on the left, that would be the changes in the U.S. import market shares throughout 2016 to 2022. The and Vietnam's gain in U.S. import market share far exceed the other countries that would usually be considered as beneficiary from friendshoring or nearshoring, such as Canada or Mexico. So after the trade war, Vietnam experienced a surge in trade, especially in the 301 targeted sectors. Other than that, Vietnam is exposed to both sides of tariff. US and China it extensively trade with both sides of the trade war, and its production overlaps with certain sectors, uh, with certain sector in China. For example, in comparative advantage, such as textile, electronic, and furniture, which make Vietnam a very interesting case study uh, out of other countries. So what we are focusing on is how do firms in Vietnam adjust within this global value chain reconfiguration. So in this paper, we focus on the processing firms. We identify firms and classify them into four groups of firms that process goods for the Chinese market, firms that process goods for the US market, for both market, and we have firms that process for neither of these market as the control group. The reason why we choose processing firms for this study is that first of all, the the data from VS quite is quite rich on firms' input and output. So processing firm, we have the input and output identified quite clearly compared to other firms, which make it very which make the identification really cleanly. So and other than that, processing firms, um, processing firms processing firm good are treated differently. So the input and output going through the border of Vietnam do not expect they do not have duties or taxes going through the borders, and they are monitored quite closely. So these are processing firms in Vietnam. So for this film, we are sure that there are no rerouting because they are monitored quite closely compared to other exporting firms, which make our identification really clearly. Um, processing film is quite significant in Vietnam's economy as well. Uh, that so 20% of Vietnam's export is composed of the processing goods, which make this quite have an effect on Vietnam's economy. So in this paper, we will also be looking at the heterogeneities across the industries as well as from zonal nationalities. Um, so just giving an overview of the result, we have the firms that process goods for the Chinese market increase the labor demand by up to 7.2%. And this is a relative increase to the neither group. And the relative increase is concentrated in the more labor-intensive industries and are driven within the Chinese zone firms. For the US market firms, we observed that this firm increased their investment in fixed assets relative to the total assets by 2 percentage point relative to the neither market. And this is concentrated in the more technically demanding industries and as well as the industries that are in the US tariff list. Um, and, and this increase is also driven by the US market firms, Korean owned firms, I'm sorry, US owned firm, Korean owned firms, and domestically owned. We will also be looking at the margin and wages of these firms. So look at the literature and look at the aggregate numbers. The main concern that people have when they look at the aggregate number is that whether this social trade a reflection of trade transshipment, meaning good take a different path through Vietnam to the US, or is it trade diversion, meaning there's a diversion of demand from the US, by the US from China to Vietnam. So that is the most prominent question at the beginning of the trade war. And there's been research paper look at that. I'm sorry, that should be 8.8% right there. But paper by Ira, which identifies the reroutings of good, and their conclusion is that there is only 8.8% of goods. Sorry, 8.8% um of the social trade was contributed by transshipment, by rerouting. That we also have other papers that look at Vietnam's import increase from China, particularly of intermediary goods. Uh, there are big paper that look at the surging value added by exporting Vietnam. So the overall picture point away from the fact that trade trade surge in Vietnam is purely transshipment. So we are looking at more um, so we are observing more prominent changes within Vietnam, and there are people which look at that and identify that there are changes within Vietnamese market labels and within firms, which so there are positive outcomes such as increasing in wages, working hours of workers in Vietnam, especially in those regions, in those districts that are more exposed to trade wars. Research has also been looking at formality and skill upgrading of firms. So overall, this research has identified that there are real changes within Vietnamese economies. At the same time, their identification mostly use either at the district level or use the variation at the district level. Uh, and this has not been able to allow us to identify that whether who are the firms that adjust and how they adjust. And this is the main contribution of our paper, right? So we will talk about the identification strategy. Um, so, so I said we look at the processing firms and we classify them into four groups. We have the Chinese market group, we have the US market groups, we have the both market groups, and our control group is another group. And so we have an unbalanced panel, and which we will deal with this later in our result sessions. But this is an unbalanced panel. Uh, if you look at the panel on the left, this is the composition of our samples, which mainly compose of the neither group, our control group, with our China and US groups mostly equal throughout the sampling period. On the panel on the right hand, we have the flow of the goods. We have the flow of the goods. So we can have firms that have the input from yes,
Sorry, thanks, Ming. Was just two quick clarifying questions. I wonder if you could spend just a moment explaining what exactly is a processing firm and how they're observed in
right.
the data. And then, secondly, when you're classifying a processing firm as, say US market oriented versus China market oriented, how do you deal with processing firms that are like, is this like if it's a processing firm who reports exporting to, say, the US and the EU, does it get classified as exporting to the US regardless of the share of its exports to the US? Or is it only if like the US is its primary market?
Um, so we so well, first of all, describing the processing firms. These are the firms that that are hired by other firms to perform a specific stage of productions. So so we have firms in Vietnam hired by firms in any other country, such as China. Uh, China hire firms in Vietnam to process the good for them, and then that good will be exported to a target depending on the demand of the customers. So basically, um, and firms in our samples. For instance, if they are for them to be identified as the U.S. market firms, they just have to have U.S. They just have they just have to include US as one of the market that they process for. Um, so basically, we are having a dummy variable. But at the same time, later on, we will also have terms. Sorry, we will also use the continuous variables to describe this. So basically, how much they process for US, how much they process for China, basically. Uh, yeah. So we will also have this later on. Does that clarify the question?
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, that's great. So if you look at the panel on the right, we can have firms that have their input coming from China, and then they process a good, which would go to other market other than China's. But we will also have firms that process good for the US market, but their input can come from any market, basically. So, just to describe the flow of good that we're observing in our sample. Right. And here's how firms are distributed geographically in our samples. They so as you can see, firms that process good for the US market and firms that process good for Chinese market are geographically distributed quite similarly, uh, clustering around the near Hanoi and Saigon, with Chinese market firms concentrated a little bit more closer to the north, to the northern border, closer to China. And we also deal with this geographical variation in our paper, right? So in our paper, other than identifying firms based on their destination market, we also identify firms based on the industries, whether they are exposed to tariff uh, from both sides, US tariff imposed by US and tariff imposed by China. And we do this by matching the HS code from the tariff list to Vietnam SIC industrial code. So we would have a dummy variable equal to one for firm equal to one if they operate in the industries that have product in the tariff in either of the tariff lists. So firms can be exposed to the US market or firms can be exposed to the Chinese market tariff. Right. Um, so overall, the our paper rely on three sources of data. We have the VES data from obtained from the GSO, General Statistic Office. Sorry, VS meaning Vietnamese Enterprise Survey, and um, and our sampling period ranging from 2016 to 2023, composing of over 1,000 processing firms. We have the tariff data, and then we also use the ownership nationality. We have the data on the ownership nationality. This data was manually collected with the tax ID firms from the VES, and we track these firms on the national database, a registry database. Right. So that is our um, data sources. For this paper, we use a difference in different specifications. We have the we have the treated variable interacting with the post 2018 variables. The treated variable um, has three versions. So we are having firms equal to so firms can be US market, China market, and both market. Uh, so those firms will have this variable equal to one and zero for the neither market. And we use firm and year fixed effect. And extending on this, we also have we're extending this to triple interactions to include the tariff terms, meaning whether firms operate in the industries that are exposed to the two side of the tariff. Right. So that was the empirical strategies, and let's move on to our result. So any question on the empirical strategies? Okay, so I will move on to the result session. So here's our baseline result. As you can see from the tables, we have the Chinese market firms after 2018, they increased their labor demand by 7.2% relative to the neither market. On the other on the other side of the table, we have firms that process goods for the US market, which increase their investment in fixed assets relative to their total assets by 1.8 percentage point. So this is our baseline market. We also we also perform this specifications, but reclassify them based on the input. Um, the hyperlink is so we also so we reclassify them based on their input, and we rerun the specification. And what we find is that the what we see in our main result is not driven by where firms get their input from, but ma but mainly just where the good go to. So that's what we are observing. And we also, sorry, so as I explained earlier, we also use the continuous exposure measure. So how much firms are processing for the Chinese market and uh process for how much firms are processing for the US market, and the result hold for these specifications. Right. Um, so since our pet, yes,
Yeah, sorry, thanks, Ming. If you just go back to the first set of regression results, the yeah, is this
yeah.
coefficient in column two, negative 0.111? What do you have an explanation for why employment would be falling in firms that are processing to the US, since this seems like it should be a positive labor demand shock, right? So I'm a little bit concerned that the sign is not in the way that at least I would have ex ante expected it. So I'm just curious if you've looked into that a little bit more.
Yes. Thank you for the questions. Very useful questions. So later on, we also look at the we also look at firm changes in margins, and apparently those firms that process good for the Chinese market that increase the labor demand, increase their margins, but firms that process good for the US market um have that increase in their investment in fixed assets reduce have their margin uh, have their margin decrease. So what I guess from this result is that firms have to invest into the fixed assets, and to kind of preserve that margin, they employ less labor, so they are becoming more capital intensive throughout the process, basically. And the industries that firms and the industries that firms increase investment in fixed assets is also really more capital intensive, more technically demanding, which we will also see later. Is that fine? Right. So um, is that fine if I leave the slide like this instead of going full screen, since the hyperlink doesn't seem to work in the full screen mode? Uh, yeah, and this, yeah. So since our panel is unbalanced panel, and we also observe firms that are switching around the markets, um, we we tackle this by excluding this firm from our samples and rerun the regressions. So basically, we have firm processing market kept constant throughout, and these are the firms that appear throughout the sampling period. So no entry and exiting firms, and the result appear to be increase in the in the magnitude of the coefficients as well as the significant levels. So the the adjustment that we observe in the baseline right here is mostly from the incumbent firms, is what we are seeing. We also run a event study. So for this, we have firms with sorry, that should be FA. So for this, um, with the Y variable relative to the mean of pre-2018 level. So what we are seeing here is that the increase in the employment demand, as well as the increase in the fixed assets investment, is mostly a relative increase of these firms relative to the neither market is basically what we are observing. Right. We yes.
Sorry, yeah, sorry to interrupt again. This is just actually kind of a follow-up to one of the questions that was in the chat. I was also curious
Right.
to see the event study, but I'm a little bit unsure about what is the omitted baseline year here, because I thought, if I remember from your data slide, that you're using data from 2016 through
Uh,
2023. So I would
that's
have
right. Yeah.
expected one of these coefficients to be sort of normalized to zero and everything's identified relative to that baseline year.
Yeah, that's right. It does kind of make the well, yeah, making everything relative to the 2018 means kind of push things before 2018 closer to zero. Uh, this is what we did this due to the fact that if we also did the event study, the usual event study here, but as you can see, since we only have 2 years before 2018, the 2017 years got omitted from the result, which is why we did this additional um, specification so that the year doesn't get omitted. Basically, we only have data from 2018, basically mean because of the um, the data on processing firms from the VS only available from 2016, so on. Yeah. Is that fine?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Right. So the overall decline here, is I think what we're observing here is the decline of the processing sector in general after the COVID period. Um, so yeah, this is what we are hypothesizing from this. For the robustness check, other than the event study, we also use the raw data, so raw count of employment, uh, and we also include other expenses, such as investment expenses on repairing and upgrading. So we use automated measurements. We also use placebo tests, randomizing the timing of the shock, as well as randomizing firms market. Other than that, we also include other variable like labor supply, state ownership, and the number of contract countries of firms. And since our study period coincide with COVID, um, we also take into account the effect of the COVID by using variation of lockdown provinces. Right. So that was the baseline result that we are seeing that we just saw. Um, the remaining question is the mechanism that drive the changes that we saw in the baseline result. And so we identify the mechanism by looking at the heterogeneities of these adjustments. So first of all, we look at the heterogeneities across industries. So we rerun the baseline across the industries. So on the panel on the left, uh, we have the increase in employment in the Chinese market firms, mostly in the textile, apparel, and leather industries. So which are the industries that are considered the more labor intensive, more traditional labor intensive industries. On the other hand, we have the US market from increase in fixed assets investment, which uh, is significant in the more technically demanding industries like heavy manufacture, like industrial support service and ICT and electrical equipment. So now that we are identified that there are heterogeneities is difference in the across the two groups of firms, uh, we look at whether this heterogeneities and the adjustment in the baseline is driven by the tariff. So this is the result for the triple interactions specification that I presented earlier. We have the increase in the US tariff, we have the increase in fixed assets purchase by the US market firms become more significant in those industries that are affected by tariff imposed by the US on China. On the other hand, this tariff do not have any effect on firms that process for the Chinese market's increase in employment. So, um, which is understandable and quite intuitive. So other than the US tariff, we also look at the tariff imposed by China on the US goods. And as you can see, that there are no term significance in these specifications, which indicate that that the adjustment of firms in this is disregard of the Chinese tariff of where the firms are processing in in the industries exposed to the Chinese tariff. Right. So that was the industrial heterogeneities. We also look at the heterogeneity across the firm's owner nationalities to give a sense of the of our samples. We plot how often this nationality appears in our samples to against the size of that nationalities of the economic size of that nationalities. And as you can see from the plot, the observation of this nationality broadly track the size of its economies. Apart from with Vietnam's, obviously because we're in Vietnam and we have Korean and Japan and China, which is widely known to be a lot more active in Vietnam. So just to give a sense of our samples. So for firms nationalities, for the specifications, we rerun the baseline but start dropping off the nationalities, but start dropping off the nationalities. So when we drop firms that are owned by the Chinese, we have the our result loses significance. And that does not happen with any other nationalities. So what we are seeing is that the adjustment that we saw in the baseline within firms that process goods for the Chinese market is driven by firms that are owned by the Chinese, basically. So we rerun this for the US market firms. We also start dropping off the nationalities, and what we find is that is a is a broader effect with nationality that that drive the changes include Koreans, US and domestically owned. To um, so just to revisit the these two results, we also have we have the we'll also obtain the data on the share of the foreign ownership of these firms. So from the result table, you can see that within the Chinese zone firms, the more they are the more they are owned by foreign owners, the the more the more employment the stronger the employment increases, and that does not happen for the U.S. and Korean and domestically owned firms, which indicate that which further indicate that the adjustment that we're seeing in this Chinese zone in this Chinese zone firms is driven by by the fact that they are owned by the Chinese. So we also have the result on the position of the supply chain. This result is not included in our uh, in our um, uh, in our main text, but I think it would be very interesting to share it here with everyone. Um, so we constructed the firm level upstreamness um, based on firm's product. Um, we use the method published by Antras and Foley in 2012, which look at how closely firms are located relative to relative to the final demand. So so we calculate the upstreamness of firms and um and divide them into quartiles. And we rerun the baseline across these quartiles. And as you can see, hmm, sorry, I think that's wrong result. But sorry, never mind that. Um, so basically, just to kind of summarizing what we are observing so far. First of all, firms that process goods for the Chinese market increase the labor demand, and this increase is concentrated in the more labor-intensive industries and is driven by the uh, Chinese-owned firms. So what we are seeing is a preserving offshoring, where Chinese firms use Vietnam as the low cost for as a low cost assembly hub. On the other hand, we have the Chinese market firms increase in investment in fixed assets, and this is concentrated in the technically demanding, particularly tariff-exposed industries, and is driven within the firms owned by the US, Korean, and domestically owned. So what we are seeing, how we interpreting this is that this is a compliant-driven adjustment where firms are investing to meet the diverted demand to the US market. Right. So to just to reassure our our interpretation so far, we also look at the profit margin and wages, and where firms process goods for the Chinese market, that increase in employment would also increase in the profit margins. While firms that process goods for the US market, that increase in the investment in fixed assets have their margin reduced. So what we're seeing, so it further tells the story that of margin preserving offshoring of the Chinese firms, uh, as well as the market-driven, compliant-driven U.S. market firms adjustments. At the same time, we observe no changes in wages. We observe no changes in wages, indicating that there are no Um, there are no skill premium accompanied by these changes in employments and investments. So those are the overall picture that we're seeing. We have the margin preserving offshoring of the Chinese-owned firms, and we have the compliant-driven investment of the um, U.S. market processing firms, uh, and that is mostly everything in our result. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Ming. So we have quite a bit of time left over for questions at this point. I see that there's one or two in the chat if you want to maybe start with those.
Right. So you elaborate on your proof, the parallel trend um using DID in these papers. The paper measures firms exposed at industry's level. Does this approach implicitly assume that all firms within the same industries face the same level of exposure? Um, right. So, right. Let's go back to this. First of all, thank you for the questions. Uh, right. Let's see. So the question was, sorry. Should I read the question out loud again? Uh, so the question is that the paper measure firms' exposure at industry level. Does this approach implicitly assume that all firms within the same industries face the same level of exposure? Thank you for the questions. So yes, this approach does assume that, but at the same time, we also look at the we also include the measure of continuous exposure um, right here. Uh, sorry, hmm, I'm sorry, the result is not in the slide for some reason. Yes, the our approach does assume that that firms operate in the same industries would experience the same kind of exposure. At the same time, we also use the continuous tariff exposure. So there are so apart from the dummy variations, we also have we also have more variation in the industries. Uh, so if that helps. Um, does that, yes?
Hi. Yeah, I'm the one who put the question there.
Hi.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you very much for your presentation. I just wonder because I know that in the section 301, they use at the product level, so it's kind of like 8 to 10 digits. It's very detailed. While in
Yeah.
the data in the VS you use a kind of industrial code, try to match
Yeah.
them.
Mm.
Um, so I don't understand how you can um, use the continuous there, how you match these types of things together.
Our continuous, thank you for the questions. So the continuous measure that I mentioned is still only at the industry levels. Um, so we would have industries that are more exposed, which more product in that industries will be tariff than the other industries. So we can have the industries. For example, industries can have um 7 out of 10 product that are in the tariff list. We also have industries that are, for instance, can have 3 out of 10 product in the tariff list. So the variation still at the industry level. Um, but but we but by doing that we also have the more variation at industry level basically.
Yeah, got it. Thank you very much.
Is that fine? Yes.
Just as a follow-up, I am curious about the amount of industry variation that you have among the processing firms. So, for example, if I take a look at the questionnaire for 2016, it specifically asks, are you, a processing firm in textiles, footwear, electronics, phones, or other, right? So it seems to suggest that the questionnaire, based on those categories in the questionnaire, that there maybe is not a lot of variation across industries, right? That the processing is perhaps quite concentrated in just 4 or 5 industries. So I'm a little bit curious as to how many observations you would have in the other industries out of those 5 categories that are asked about. Because if you're ending up with just, say, a very
Oh,
small
right.
number of
Yeah.
firms in some of those industries, then there might just be a lot of noise creeping in for those other industries.
Uh, yeah. Thank you for the questions. So these industries are manually grouped, basically because the industries are classified in SIC 5, which would result in hundreds of industries. So so this classification of industries right here is manually
No,
uh
no, sorry, I think you're
placed.
misunderstanding
Yeah,
my question. I'm not saying that there's not different industries. I'm
yeah,
just wondering, for example, like in chemicals and minerals, like that first industry category at the top here, how many firm observations do you have? That's sort of the root of my question. Is I'm concerned that outside
right.
of the core processing industries, that the rest of the industries you'll have very, very small number of observations.
Mm, right. Thank you. I think that's a good question. I am not sure how many firms for each of these categories, but you're right that that should be clarified, better clarified in our papers. Right. There's no question in the chat. I think. Right. What the theory about trade war effect on law of employment on Vietnam specific firms. However, the result on fixed assets uh of those two US are not consistent. Investment in fixed assets is intermittent. The result could be influenced by extremes, uh, values outlier. You might think of running median regressions, as reverse check. Thank you for suggestions. Very helpful. I definitely try that, and include that in our robust check. Um,
Just as a follow-up, because I had kind of related thoughts, it might be worth thinking about a conceptual framework for why the firms that are oriented towards the US market, why they would be changing their production function, right? Like your argument is that they're becoming more capital intensive, whereas that same pattern doesn't seem to hold for the processing firms who are oriented towards China. Um, so yeah, just thinking conceptually ahead of time about why that's the case, because otherwise it feels a little bit difficult to understand why the patterns would be so different. I don't have a clear story in my mind as to why I would expect the US firms to respond, sorry, the US oriented firms to respond by becoming more capital intensive, whereas the ones oriented towards the Chinese market do something quite different. Um, and your argument, I think, it was a little bit about the
yeah,
US oriented ones are in different industries, but then if so, why
yeah.
why weren't they more capital intensive ahead of the shock, right? Like what about the shock makes them become more capital intensive? That to me isn't clear at this point.
Mm, well, the way I'm interpreting this is that when the trade war happens, firms are expecting diverted demand uh, to the US, and that would be um, see, hmm, sure. That's quite interesting to think about. Thank you for raising it up. Why wouldn't it increase before a shock? Hmm, I would think they are um preparing ahead, preparing for more because firms are also processing for other market as well, right? So when they are getting ready for even higher demand from the US, I would think they invest more for that section of their processing units.
Yeah,
Uh,
but if they're like, say, for example, they're like
wait,
a
what?
firm, say relatively capital intensive compared to say textiles or footwear. Um, and they're oriented towards two markets. Suppose they export some of their electronics to the US, some of their electronics to China, right? Your argument is that, the demand, or sorry, let's say some to the US and some to, to some other third market.
Yeah.
Your argument is that, the demand shock specifically from the US somehow causes them to change their production technology in a way that if it was a rising demand from the EU, that they wouldn't, right? So there's something about them exporting that particular product to the US compared to somewhere else that causes them to shift their capital labor intensity. And
Mm,
I don't see why that would be as good
right.
as compared to just like it's a scale effect. They have increased demand, so they're just going to use more inputs and they're going to produce more output. What is it about the U.S. exporting to the U.S. that causes them to change their production function? I think that needs to be thought about a little bit more.
I understand. I understand. You're right. Definitely worth thinking about. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and then there was
The
another question that was just recently added to the
yeah,
chat as well. If you want to take a quick look.
does they allow you to tease out more details about fixed assets investments? Like yeah, so we also look at the type of investment. So in a VS we have investment in fixed assets that include constructions, uh without constructions, and then um on repairing and upgrading and upgrading existing the existing fixed assets. And what we are seeing is that the increase in fixed assets is mostly the on constructions. So I think they are building more and expanding um in their production capacity as well. The level of technology thing. Is that does that answer what for you?
Yeah. Thanks for that because it's a little bit
Mm,
tied into what Brian was talking about in
yeah.
terms of the
Right.
mechanism, right? Whether I'm wondering whether any hints can be you guess with a scale effect or it's like a technological
Yeah.
change
Yeah.
or upgrading. But if you're saying
Yeah.
it's construction, then it's quite curious, right?
This
Why just like firms serving the U.S. market? Because construction sounds
yeah,
to be
yeah.
like a scale effect kind of thing.
Mm, uh yeah, I would say so. The so the non-constructions investment in fixed assets appear to be insignificant, but only significant for the constructions. But at the same time, construction can also be upgrading, right? Uh, they're building newer infrastructures. At the same time, that new can also be upgrading, like new technology, new way of producing, for example.
Okay. Any last questions? Feel free to either, just unmute yourself and speak out, or put it in the chat like some others have done. Okay, I don't see anything more at this point. So let's just take a moment to thank Ming again for his presentation. Thank you very much for joining us today, everyone, as well. And then one quick announcement, there won't be a seminar in September just because I have a bit of a heavy travel schedule. It's going to be a little bit difficult to get something scheduled for September. But we do have two presentations scheduled. The exact date's still to be determined, but two planned in October and November, coming up in the fall as well too. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us. And I look forward to hopefully seeing many of you at our future seminars as well.
Thank you everyone for being here today. Thank you, Brian, for the opportunities.